start with the head and work our way back. In developing the basic idea of the head, you didn't have to do nearly as much as what I did. All I asked was that you try to visualize or think of the structure of the skull as a box. The herbivore we looked at has a sphere with that long snout. But dogs and cats, I'm going to design this the same way. But notice that I'm building the box off the corners of the eye socket. And then I'm dropping it down to kind of exclude, at least in this representation, any of the nasal structure. If it makes sense, just think of a mailbox in front and then use this to determine the proportion of the snout. Now I can line this up here, and what this plane does gives me the turn of the cheek or bottom of the eye socket. And all of these points line up on that line. And that gives you two forms, which I think are useful in cats because since their heads are always low, it can be difficult to see the foreshortening at times in that area. So that's the basic structure. On top, we're just going to build out some of the form qualities that will help it resonate as something more organic. So in doing that, what I'll be looking for would be to add the ramp. That's one of the initial secondary perspectives that helps integrate a lot of these larger ones. So like you took a little door wedge and then just built it across here. This would be kind of like the keystone in a human portrait. That bone that sits between the sockets that leads down into the nasal saddle. So here's a center line. Use that as a symmetry line of the face. That way you can judge proportions and foreshortening on either side. And then let's put on a nose. That's working down. So this is the septum of the nose. You can start up here. And then how it gives this rounded quality to the top of the mailbox. Something I try to think about as secondary. And so that I have imagined putting like a shaved or part of a cylinder over this. And so it's building just that much over the top of that structure. And then when it turns the plane, I can let that fall a bit into the design of the nose right here. And I think that's always much more triangular in cats. So it looks like this. I have the nostril moving up here. And then when it turns the corner on that mailbox, I shift the line down. And then here's my triangle shape. For the eyes, before we get down into the mouth, you could think of the eye structure here. So one thing I'll do with the eyes often is just lay in a sphere first. So here's a ball, right? And then I could kind of work the design of some of the anatomy or ideas that we've discussed so far around it. And even though it was brief, we did talk a little bit about the nasalis muscles, which are muscles that would flow from up here and then down. So this is how I would use some of these planes that I set up to understand anatomy, okay? Because every line affects the way that an anatomical piece flows across that surface. And that's something that we've been talking about with our muscle shapes. So that piece looks like this. You can see kind of muscles. Over this would be the whisker bed. I know we've talked about that. Once this is done, this also gives me this kind of transition plane, or that nice leaning plane off the side of the mailbox, so filling in some of the more organic aspects. The eye, you can think of that principle that we talked about on the human, that canthal ligament. That would be part of what gives this dark connection down here. Moves up around the eye itself, and then because the head is bowed, we see the eye kind of look like that, wrapping that way, and then as soon as it hits the form, it wraps around the ball. So that's my basic eye shape, and then we could see there's that really cool looking light coloring under. And then over, we can put some of these fattier, softer shapes. Directly under this, so you can see all this dark that's starting to form, that's the pole of the bone. And so now that cheekbone, or the thinking of the skull, has some value, and then pulls down into the face. Right, but as it makes this transition here, it takes on, or it can, depending on the lighting, it can take on some value. So I see some value under the corner of the eye, and then partly under the cheekbone itself. Okay, let's start moving our way down, since we have somewhat developed eye, into the mouth. Mouth is always a peace sign. So there's the start of it. pull out to the mailbox to that corner. So that's just a template. I obviously don't want to draw a cat head as a mailbox and then try to show people. I'm using it as like training wheels. So that's the kind of the fullness of the whisker bed. Just think of that whisker bed on top. And then all the, if you were to draw in whiskers, they always go in a pretty organized line. Okay, so that's that fullness to the end of the mouth. And then if you look at the corner of the lip there, it's very commonly under the eye. And so that'll be something that's like people too. The corner of the mouth lines up with the center of the eye. So that's where this line falls to once it hits that corner. That way I don't have happy smiling cats. So I want this to feel like it's kind of sagging, and then I'll bring it back up. And then let's consider some of the anatomy that would help the jaw feel realistic. In terms of additional muscles here, if you're struggling with this idea, the idea of that mouth that kind of sags down, one way you could think of it is that the muscle that connects to that that zygomatic major comes all the way from up by the ear. And it's a thinner muscle. And even though it can help hold this area, it doesn't have a massive influence at rest. Right? So it does have this feeling like it's sagging down. It might be overly complicated, but you never know. So oxygenator, we think about a secondary shape. One way to generalize what's happening here would be a simple egg, like that. And then behind that, or kind of maintaining the majority of this portion of the box, would be masseter. Right, so that's here underneath, and then all of this I'm thinking of as that giant powerful muscle of mastication. That's going up to the underside of the cheek. Cheek there. Let's put on an ear for good measure. If I can find the cheek here, one thing I always try to do with the ear is use it to slice part of the box, because again, I don't want people to see this rigid cube, right? It's a means to an end. So the ear is an opportunity to start to carve or customize that. All of these steps are related and interchangeable depending on what you find to be useful, what matches with your drawing style, etc. So here's the ear, in other words, if you did go through this process, relates to that plane, right, by way of the line making an exact kind of transition across it. But then the ear also kind of folds and wraps with the back of the head. So I think that's an important rhythm, because sometimes I'll draw cats and then my ear looks like it's just hanging off the side unrelated. Right, it'll just look like boop. Right, so I want to make sure I get something that feels connected. And then once I have this, you think of it as a base or an elliptical or cylindrical base, and then I develop an ear shape up from there. With cats, I would try to keep it somewhat conical, but I'll use this idea, right, because now it looks like it's turned back. But if I think of it from a different angle, right, here's the same start. If the ear were turned forward, I would use this shape, same shape more or less, and then open it, right, by way of showing a thickness and then an inside. And so that helps me to turn the ear. It gives me latitude in turning the ear. Okay, so not exactly like what we're seeing, but a process of head construction in a generic sense that'll hopefully help you make sure that you're able to break down any number of feline-based animals.